You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. For several decades, the United States has been grappling with the decision of whether to extract oil from the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, known as the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, a topic that has sparked considerable debate since 1977. In one corner, the Republicans have been pushing to open up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for drilling, and they finally managed to do so through the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed in 2017. On the other side, environmentalists and conservationists are concerned about the potential damage to the region's wildlife, particularly the effects on the porcupine caribou's breeding grounds. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is an enormous area, spanning 19 million acres on the north coast of Alaska, with the Beaufort Sea to the north, the Brooks Range Mountains to the south, and Prudhoe Bay to the west. It is the United States' largest designated wilderness area, a status confirmed by Congress with the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act in 1980. A specific section of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, referred to as the 1002 area, which covers 1.5 million acres, was set aside by that act to decide later how to manage oil and gas activities there. A key element of the drilling debate is balancing the projected amount of oil that could be economically recovered against the potential damage to wildlife. The film Being Caribou documented the porcupine caribou's migratory journey to illustrate the stakes involved if drilling proceeds, aiming to raise public awareness. There has also been friction surrounding the scientific studies during the Trump era, where concerns about the study's methods and transparency have been voiced by Department of the Interior staffers, though these reports are still cited by drilling proponents as evidence that local wildlife wouldn't be significantly harmed. Fast forward to December 3, 2020, when the Bureau of Land Management announced a forthcoming sale of oil and gas leases in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, live streaming a bidding event on January 6, 2021. Just before the change in presidential administrations, the Trump government issued the leases on January 19. Immediately after taking office, President Joe Biden put these drilling activities on pause with an executive order. By June that year, Interior Secretary Deb Haaland went further, suspending all leases from the previous administration while a thorough review was conducted on the environmental impacts of drilling in this region. Most recently, on September 6, 2023, the Biden administration officially canceled those leases. Alaska officially became a state on the 3rd of January, 1959, and at that time, nearly the entire land area, amounting to 375 million acres, was federal wilderness. Statehood meant that Alaska could select 103 million acres to assist its economy and generate taxes. In 1966, Alaska natives opposed a federal oil and gas lease sale, arguing it infringed upon lands they claimed. By the end of the year, the Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udall, paused the sale. He then stopped the distribution of any federal land in Alaska until Congress could resolve native land claims. This action led to the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971, which granted natives 44 million acres and suspended the development of federal lands until decisions about parks and other protected areas were finalized. This law would expire in 1978. As the Trans-Alaska Pipeline was nearing completion in 1976, conservation groups concentrated on protecting the untouched Alaskan wilderness. The U.S. House of Representatives, with support from President Jimmy Carter, passed a bill on the 16th of May, 1979, to protect over 125 million acres, including an essential caribou breeding ground. The bill, led by Morris K. Udall and John B. Anderson, aimed to prohibit commercial activity on 67 million acres designated as wilderness. Previous versions had faced opposition and filibusters in the Senate. On the 2nd of December, 1980, President Carter signed the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act into law, establishing over 104 million acres of protected land in Alaska. The act permitted potential drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, but only with congressional approval, and following an environmental impact study. The act necessitated a detailed report on all fish and wildlife in the Arctic Refuge coastal plain, also known as the 1002 area, before any further decisions on management or drilling could proceed. In 1985, Chevron drilled a deep test well within the borders of ANWR, But the outcomes of this test, referred to as KIC-1, remain confidential. The next year, a draft report by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recommended opening the entire coastal plain within the refuge for oil and gas development. Conservationists expressed alarm that such development could damage the porcupine caribou and the region's sensitive ecosystems. The proposal encountered significant opposition, led by Morris Udall, who pushed for designating the coastal plain as a wilderness area. On the 17th of July, 1987, the United States and Canada signed a treaty to protect the porcupine caribou herd and its habitat. The treaty required any activity likely to be harmful to the herd to undergo a thorough impact assessment and involve consultation with the other country. In 1989, following the Exxon Valdez oil spill, a bill permitting drilling in the reserve was halted and eventually discarded. Despite efforts in the 1990s and 2000s, including a veto by President Clinton and endeavors by George W. Bush to promote drilling, the preservation of the refuge largely endured. However, in 2017, the Republican-led Congress and President Trump's administration took steps to facilitate drilling in ANWR's 1002 area. This initiative intensified in 2019, with plans for lease sales by the end of the year. Nevertheless, in 2020, financial institutions such as Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan Chase declared they wouldn't finance drilling in the region. Legal challenges ensued as 15 states sought to halt the drilling due to regulatory concerns. Although the required sale occurred in January 2021, it attracted little interest, with bids for only half of the offered leases. In 2021, the Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, paused the leases from the Trump era, which led to calls for making this suspension permanent. Finally, on the 6th of September 2023, the Biden administration canceled the leases, marking the end of a protracted debate over oil and gas drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. In 1998, the United States Geological Survey provided some numbers on the potential oil resources in a place called the Coastal Plain area of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. They estimated that there could be anywhere from 5.7 billion to 16 billion barrels of oil and natural gas liquids that we could technically extract. On average, they think there's about 10.4 billion barrels, and out of that, 7.7 billion barrels are under what's known as the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge 1002 area, which is managed by the federal government. When you look at the rest of the United States, the estimate for undiscovered oil that we could get our hands on is around 120 billion barrels. But it's important to note that these numbers for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and other undiscovered oil are considered prospective resources, not confirmed oil reserves. The United States Department of Energy tells us that the confirmed oil reserves in the U.S. are roughly 29 billion barrels, with 21 billion barrels being crude oil. Looking globally at numbers from various sources compiled by the Department of Energy, the world's confirmed reserves of oil and gas condensate seem to hover between 1.1 trillion and 1.3 trillion barrels. However, when it comes to the oil resources in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, there's a fair bit of uncertainty. The Department of Energy has said that our estimates are mainly based on the knowledge of how much oil similar geologic formations have produced in nearby state lands, which continue into the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Because of this, they highlight that there are significant unknowns around the actual size and quality of the oil resources in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, so predicting how much oil we might ultimately get and how fast we can pump it out is pretty uncertain. In 2010, the United States Geological Survey revisited their estimates for a different area, the National Petroleum Reserve Alaska, which is to the west of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. They now believe it has around 896 million barrels of oil that we have yet to discover. This is a lower number than what they previously thought, based on new drilling data that showed many areas expected to contain oil actually contain natural gas instead. Now, if we turn to the topic of what might happen if we start developing oil and natural gas in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge 1002 area, production could kick off in 2018, and by 2027 we might see about 780,000 barrels per day in this scenario with the average amount of resources. That might drop slightly to 710,000 barrels per day by 2030. In the scenarios where resources are at the low or high end, we're looking at anywhere from 510,000 to 1.45 million barrels per day at their peak in 2028. From 2018 to 2030, the total additional amount of oil that could potentially be produced ranges from 1.9 billion to 4.3 billion barrels, depending on whether we're looking at low or high resource cases. For a snapshot of current consumption, in 2017, the U.S. used up nearly 19.9 million barrels of petroleum products every single day. We managed to produce about 9.4 million barrels of crude oil daily and imported an additional 7.9 million barrels of crude, along with 2.2 million barrels of other petroleum products. Let's talk about oil production at the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, also known as ANWR for short. By 2030, the amount of oil we will get from there will likely only be a tiny slice of the global pie, somewhere between 0.4% to 1.2% of what the entire world uses. What this means is we should not expect this to significantly affect oil prices around the world. The experts at the Energy Information Administration have analyzed the data, and they are informing us that even when we review historical oil price trends, ANWR's impact on global oil prices is practically negligible. They have made some forecasts regarding the prices. In the scenario where the oil is low in sulfur and easy to refine, the most significant price reduction we might see would be approximately 41 cents lower per barrel in 2026 if a small amount of oil is discovered. Should we discover a large amount of oil, we are looking at a decrease of $1.44 per barrel by 2027. This is, of course, in comparison to the projected prices if ANWR was not a factor. However, here's the important point. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, commonly known as OPEC, maintain a significant influence over oil prices. If they choose to, they could simply reduce their oil output to offset any additional oil obtained from ANWR, thus maintaining stable prices. This assumes that the dynamics in the oil market continue as they have until now. During a speech at the GOP congressional retreat, President Donald Trump mentioned he was not initially focused on pursuing oil drilling in the Arctic Refuge, but after a conversation with a friend who is an expert in the field, who explained that Republicans have been working towards this goal for a long time, President Trump was convinced. After that I said, make sure that is in the bill, he revealed, referring to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. The idea of drilling in the Arctic Refuge has been around for a while. Back when President George W. Bush was in office, his administration was all for it. They believed drilling there could boost the economy, create jobs, help businesses grow, and reduce America's reliance on foreign oil. The Bush administration was confident that with new technology, they could access the oil in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge without causing harm to the land or the wildlife. The support for drilling in Alaska doesn't stop there. Both of Alaska's U.S. Senators, Republicans Lisa Murkowski and Dan Sullivan, are also in favor of it. And there's a group called Voice of the Arctic Inupiat, which represents indigenous Inupiaq people and their culture, that supports the development too. The American public's opinion about drilling in the Arctic Refuge has seen some shifts. A Pew Research poll from June 29, 2008, showed that half of the Americans polled were in favor of it, while 43% were against it. A noticeable change from earlier that year when more people were opposed than supportive. By the end of August 2008, a CNN poll found an increase in support, with 59% in favor of drilling for oil there. Additionally, in Alaska, residents get an annual payout from a permanent fund that is topped up, in part, by the money from oil lease revenues. Back in 2013, this dividend amounted to $900 for each Alaskan resident. Looking at the bigger picture, the United States Department of Energy has some interesting estimates. They think that if oil production in the Arctic Refuge starts between 2018 and 2030, it could potentially cut down the amount of money the U.S. spends on imported oil by about $135 to $327 billion, considering the prices back in 2006. This reduction could help lower the U.S.'s foreign trade deficit. Lastly, let's talk about the broader context of wildlife refuges and oil and gas activities. Arctic Power points out information from a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service report. Out of the 567 wildlife refuges across 22 states, 77 have oil and gas operations. Louisiana is home to the most, having 19 refugees with these activities, while Texas comes in second with 11 refugees. And out of all these refugees, oil or gas production is happening in 45 units across 15 states, with the number of wells ranging from just 1 up to over 300, like in Louisiana's Upper Ouachita National Wildlife Refuge. On the day he began his presidency, Joe Biden took action to stop new drilling for oil in the Arctic. He then went on to hold back drilling leases in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in June of 2021. Gina McCarthy, the White House's top person on climate, stated, "President Biden believes America's national treasures are cultural and economic cornerstones of our country." On September 6, 2023, those leases were completely scrapped by the Biden team. Former President Barack Obama was against drilling in this Arctic sanctuary as well. He made his stance clear when he said, "I strongly reject drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge because it would irreversibly damage a protected national wildlife refuge without creating sufficient oil supplies to meaningfully affect the global market price or have a discernible impact on U.S. energy security." Senator John McCain, during his campaign for president in 2008, likened drilling in the refuge to drilling in other iconic places like the Grand Canyon or the Everglades, implying that it should remain untouched. Uncertainties about how much oil is actually in the Arctic refuge were noted by the U.S. Department of Energy in 2008. They said that we don't really know much about the oil that's there, and that even if we did drill, it wouldn't make a big dent in world oil prices or production. This drilling wouldn't add much to the total amount of oil the world produces and could even cause a decrease elsewhere. They put things into perspective, noting that the U.S. used over 7 billion barrels of oil in just 1 year, while the refuge might have around 10 billion barrels, with about 7.7 billion in the region proposed for drilling. Environmental advocates and many Democrats in Congress have pushed back against drilling because of how it could upset wildlife. They're concerned about the harm to animals like the 129,000 caribou born in the area, due to all the construction and risk of oil leaks. The Natural Resources Defense Council opposes the claim that the drilling would concentrate on a small area, stating it would actually spread across the entire 1.5 million acres of the refugee's coastal plain. The complexity of life, both large animals and small life forms in this part of Alaska, is something the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service highlighted, emphasizing the interdependence of these species and the importance of preserving natural habitats. Interestingly, prior to 2008, about 39% of people in the U.S. and the majority in Canada did not support drilling in the refuge. The stance of the local tribes is also clear. They are against it. The Alaska Intertribal Council, representing many Native Alaskan tribes, is firmly opposed. Lucy Beach, speaking for the Gwich'in people in 2005, called it a human rights issue, especially because of how it could affect the caribou, which are vital for their sustenance. Other indigenous groups, including the Inupiat and Gwich'in people, worry their way of life would be harmed by drilling. Some Inupiat folks from a place called Point Hope recognize that allowing drilling in the refuge could set a precedent for other wilderness areas. Many indigenous groups, including the Tanana Chiefs Conference and the National Congress of American Indians, want sustainable energy practices instead of drilling. In 2006, the village of Kaktovik called out Shell Oil as a threat and took a stand against their offshore leasing, which wasn't directly about the Arctic refuge drilling but highlighted tensions around oil companies' respect for local communities and protection of wildlife like bowhead whales. In 2017, as part of a major tax overhaul, drilling in the refuge was put on the table, and despite objections from moderates like Representative Carlos Curbelo, who sent a letter to the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell urging him to drop the drilling provision, it remained in the bill. Yet Curbelo voted for the final bill, which did include the drilling language. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.